The Hit by Rich von Halt. Frank Meseros gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white as he navigated the open road with single-minded focus. The engine roared, propelling his car forward, the landscape blurring past the windows. He turned, veering off the main thoroughfare, the tires crunching against the unpaved ground as he plunged into the woods. The dense foliage closed in around him, the canopy overhead casting dappled shadows across the hood of the car. Frank pressed on, the vehicle bouncing and jostling over the uneven terrain, branches scraping against the sides like grasping fingers. Deeper and deeper he drove, until the woods swallowed him whole, the outside world vanishing behind a curtain of leaves and shadows. At last, he brought the car to a halt, the sudden silence broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine. Frank stepped out, his boots sinking into the soft earth, the scent of pine and damp moss filling his nostrils. He strode to the rear of the car, purpose in every step, and popped the trunk with a metallic click. The trunk yawned open, revealing its macabre contents. Frank reached inside, his hand steady as he grasped the Hit, the weight of it familiar in his grip. He lifted it out, the sunlight filtering through the leaves glinting off the polished surface. The burden of what he was about to do settled heavily on his shoulders, but there was no turning back now. Frank marched behind the Hit, his gun held at the ready by his side. The Hit stumbled forward, a cloth tied tightly around his head, his hands bound in front of him. He shuffled through the underbrush in his pajamas, the thin fabric snagging on the grasping branches. They pushed deeper into the woods until they reached a small clearing, the trees pressing in on all sides like silent sentinels. Frank yanked the cloth from the Hit's head, revealing a face etched with fear, eyes glistening with unshed tears. The Hit's voice quavered as he spoke, a desperate prayer falling from his lips. "Lord, give me strength in my weakness." He paused, drawing a shuddering breath. "Give me faith in my fear." Another beat, his words barely a whisper. "Give me power in my powerlessness." Frank raised his gun, the muzzle hovering just behind the Hit's head. With his free hand, he grasped the metal charm dangling from his necklace, bringing it to his lips in a reverent kiss. "I'm trusting you," the Hit murmured, his voice carrying a resigned acceptance. "Amen," Frank breathed, his eyes sliding shut. In one fluid motion, Frank's finger tightened on the trigger, the sharp crack of the gunshot shattering the silence of the woods. The bullet tore through the air, finding its mark with brutal precision. The Hit crumpled to the ground, his body hitting the earth with a dull thud, a crimson stain blooming across the fallen leaves. Frank stood motionless, the weight of his actions settling heavily upon him. The acrid scent of gunpowder mingled with the coppery tang of blood, the air thick with the finality of what he had done. Days later, Frank stepped off the Metro mover, his lean figure cutting through the bustling crowd. In his late 20s, with dark curly hair and a gruff exterior, he exuded an air of quiet intensity. He lit a cigarette, the smoke curling around his face as he strode down the busy city street, his gaze fixed ahead. A man shoved a woman nearby, but Frank didn't spare them a glance, his mind focused on the task at hand. He approached the post office, his steps purposeful. Inside the mailroom, Frank's fingers skimmed over the lockers until they landed on 110. He glanced around, his hand delving into his jacket, rummaging for a moment before emerging with a set of keys. With a deft movement, he slid the locker door open, peering inside. He reached in, his fingers closing around a manila envelope, and pulled it out, shutting the locker with a soft click. The keys disappeared back into his pocket as he turned to leave. Outside the jazz club entrance, Johnny Russo stood, a young man in his 20s, clad in a music band t-shirt, sports coat, and jeans. A guitar case dangled from his hand, a testament to his passion. From across the street, Frank watched him through binoculars, munching on potato chips, Russo's profile paperwork spread out on the car seat beside him. Frank entered the jazz club, his eyes scanning the dimly lit interior. The sound of music filled the air, and his gaze landed on the stage where Johnny rehearsed, his fingers dancing over the strings of his guitar. Frank lingered in the shadows, observing, his mind whirring with calculations and possibilities. The weight of the manila envelope in his jacket pocket served as a constant reminder of the mission that lay ahead, a mission that would soon intertwine his path with that of the unsuspecting musician. Frank settled onto a stool at the bar, the leather creaking beneath him as he fished out his phone and placed it on the polished wood. "Club soda," he called to the bartender, his voice low and gruff. The bartender slid a napkin in front of him, followed by a small glass of fizzing club soda, a red stirrer bobbing in the clear liquid. "$3.50, he announced, wiping his hands on a towel. Frank tossed 4 crumpled dollar bills onto the bar, which the bartender scooped up with a nod. Plucking the red stirrer from his drink, Frank flicked it aside, the bartender replacing it with 2 shiny quarters. Frank's fingers closed around the cool metal, tapping them absent-mindedly on the bar as he turned his attention to the stage. Johnny finished the song with a flourish, his mates laughing and clapping as he strummed a final riff on his guitar before setting it down. He sauntered over to the bar, plopping down next to Frank. "Yo, let me get some bourbon," Johnny called, holding up his index finger and thumb. "That much?" The bartender chuckled. "You got it." Frank nodded towards the stage. "Good set." Johnny grinned. "Thanks, but we were just rehearsing. The real party's tonight. You should come back." "I have plans, but that could change," Frank replied, taking a sip of his club soda, the bubbles fizzing on his tongue. The bartender set Johnny's bourbon in front of him, the amber liquid sloshing in the glass. Johnny reached into his pocket, producing a small baggie of pills. He placed them on the bar, crushing them beneath his fist, the powder scattering across the polished wood. Frank watched, his expression inscrutable, as Johnny lined up the crushed pills and lowered his head, snorting the substance in one swift motion before downing the bourbon in a single gulp. "You're not wasting any time," Frank remarked, his tone dry. Johnny tilted his head back, his eyes glassy. "It's my premeditation. It calms my nerves before a gig. Don't you have any rituals before you do something big?" Frank's lips quirked. "Yeah, there's a couple things I can think of." Johnny dug into his pocket again, this time pulling out a wad of cash. He peeled off a few large bills, handing them to the bartender. "You still doing that raffle for your kid?" The bartender nodded. "Yeah." "Well, here, take this for the bourbon and the rest is for your kid," Johnny said, pressing the money into the bartender's hand. "Thanks, man," the bartender replied, shaking Johnny's hand. "Good looking." Johnny turned to Frank. "All right, man. Hope to see you tonight." "Sure thing," Frank said, raising his glass in a mock salute as Johnny sauntered out of the bar. Frank's phone vibrated, the screen lighting up. He answered, his voice curt. "Yeah?" In a hospital across town, Nurse Sophie, a young African-American woman, sat behind a desk, the phone pressed to her ear. "I'm looking for Frank Meseros?" "Who's this?" Frank demanded, his brow furrowing. "I'm calling from Baptist Hospital. I need to speak with Mr. Meseros regarding his father." "Yeah, this is he. What about?" Frank interrupted, his grip tightening on the phone. Nurse Sophie's voice softened. "He has slipped into a coma." Frank sat in stunned silence, his gaze fixed on a distant point, the weight of the news settling heavily upon him. The world seemed to fade away, the laughter and chatter of the bar receding into the background as a cold, sinking feeling took hold in the pit of his stomach. His father, the man who had shaped him, the man he had both loved and resented, now lay helpless in a hospital bed, his fate uncertain. Frank's mind raced, a million thoughts and emotions battling for dominance as he struggled to process the gravity of the situation. Now in the hospital, Frank sat motionless, his gaze fixed on a distant point, as his father, Max Meseros, lay in the hospital bed before him, the steady beep of the machines the only sound in the room. The door swung open, and Nurse Annie, an older Caucasian-American woman, entered, startling at the sight of Frank. "Oh, pardon me," she said, her voice soft as she made her way to the bedside, checking the machines with practiced efficiency. "You're the first to come visit," she remarked, glancing at Frank. "Are you related?" "I'm his son," Frank replied, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. Nurse Annie studied him, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. "You know he's still conscious. If you want to read to him or just talk, you can. Frank shook his head. We weren't much of a talking family. That's too bad, Nurse Annie said, her tone tinged with sympathy. She paused, considering her next words. Well, if you don't want to talk to him, you can always visit the chapel just to clear your head. This can be a bit much to take in at first. We weren't much of that either, Frank said, his gaze still fixed on his father's motionless form. Much of what? Nurse Annie asked, curiosity lacing her voice. Religious, Frank replied, his tone clipped. Nurse Annie smiled, a gentle, understanding curve of her lips. Darling, you don't have to be religious to talk to God. He listens to all. Frank found himself in the hospital chapel, standing at the back of the pews, his eyes drawn to the image of Jesus on the cross, the agony etched into every line of the wooden figure. Rows of candles lined the wall to his left, their flickering flames casting dancing shadows across the stone. He approached them, his steps echoing in the hushed silence of the chapel. Picking up a stick from the ashes, Frank dipped it into the fire of a lit candle, the flame catching, casting a warm glow on his face. He used the burning stick to light an unlit candle, watching as the wicks sputtered to life, the wax beginning to melt and pool around the base. Frank sank into a pew, his gaze unfocused, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The chapel door creaked open, and a few people entered, their footsteps soft on the worn carpet. Frank blinked, drawn back to the present, his hand reaching into his coat pocket. His fingers closed around a worn photograph, and he pulled it out, his eyes falling on the image of himself and the man he just killed, captured in a moment long past. Frank's eyes glazed over, lost in the labyrinth of his own thoughts, the photograph trembling in his grip. Later that day in Max's apartment, ice cubes clattered into an empty glass, the sound sharp in the stillness of the kitchen. Amber liquid sloshed over the cubes as Frank poured himself a generous measure of whiskey, the bottle clinking against the rim. He raised the glass to his lips, savoring the burn as it slid down his throat. A sudden knock at the door shattered the silence, and Frank froze, his grip tightening on the glass. He set it down with a thud, his other hand reaching for the gun tucked into his waistband. The cold metal pressed against his skin as he made his way to the living room, his footsteps muffled on the threadbare carpet. Frank peered through the peephole, his voice gruff as he called out, "Yeah?" "It's Vincent, Max's brother," came the reply, muffled by the door. Frank swung the door open, revealing a tall, skinny man in his early 50s, his salt and pepper hair and full beard unkempt. Vincent Mezaros stood before him, clad in raggedy clothes, dirty, hole-ridden jeans, a faded flannel shirt, and a beige jacket that had seen better days. Sweat glistened on his brow, and his eyes held a desperate, haunted look. Beside him stood a little girl, no more than 6 years old, her long, curly brown hair tangled around her face. She clutched a rag doll, her small fingers white-knuckled, and wore a princess costume that had seen better days. "Yes?" Frank asked, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. Vincent shifted nervously, his gaze darting past Frank into the apartment. "I heard about Max. Is anyone else here?" "No, just me. At the hospital too," Frank replied, his words clipped. Vincent's brow furrowed, confusion etched onto his weathered face. "You are?" "Frank," he said simply, his eyes never leaving Vincent's face. Recognition dawned in Vincent's eyes, and he let out a breath. "Little Frankie? It's me, Uncle Vinny." Frank nodded, his expression unchanging. "Hello, Vincent." He paused, his jaw clenching. "It's Frank now." Vincent gestured inside, a pleading look in his eyes. "Can we?" Frank stepped aside, opening the door wider, and Vincent and Emma hurried inside, the little girl's eyes wide as she took in her surroundings. Emma perched on the edge of the sofa, her doll clutched to her chest, as Vincent made his way to the kitchen, his movements jittery, his eyes darting around the room. "Man, it's been a long time since I saw you. You must have been..." Vincent turned, his gaze falling on Frank and Emma, who stared at each other in silence. "Emma's age," he finished lamely. Vincent crossed the room, his hand coming to rest on Emma's shoulder. "This is Emma," he said, his voice strained. He looked down at the little girl, his eyes softening. "Emma, This is Frank. He's your cousin. Say hello." "Hello?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. Frank nodded, his expression unreadable, and strode into the kitchen, leaving Vincent and Emma alone in the living room. He picked up his glass, the whiskey sloshing as he brought it to his lips, and leaned against the sink, his gaze fixed on the window. Vincent sank into a chair at the kitchen table, his shoulders slumped, his hands trembling. "I didn't know you kept in touch with my old man," Frank said, his voice low, accusatory. Vincent looked down at his hands, his fingers fidgeting. "It's been a while. We were just starting to—" "How come?" Frank asked, his eyes narrowing. Vincent met his gaze, his expression guarded. "Let's just say in my line of work I wasn't able to keep in touch." Frank's eyes flicked to Vincent's right hand, taking in the nasty scar that marred his ring finger. Vincent quickly covered it, but not before Frank caught a glimpse of the tattoo on his own finger. A Chinese symbol, meaning devil. "And now?" Frank asked, his voice cold. "I'm retired," Vincent said, a wry smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Frank scoffed, his lips twisting into a humorless grin. "You live around here?" "Yeah, there. I work a lot, so—" Frank shrugged, his gaze drifting to the boxes stacked in the corner. "I'm just clearing some stuff for my dad." Vincent leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "You still playing guitar?" "No, I'm in insurance now," Frank replied, his voice flat. "What happened?" "Your dad was always so proud of you when you were playing," Vincent said, his brow furrowing. Frank took a swig of whiskey, the liquid burning his throat. "I just stopped. I never got as good as I wanted to get." "Well, your dad always said you'd be a big hit one day. You must make a killing in insurance," Vincent said, his tone laced with envy. "Yeah, something like that," Frank muttered, pulling up a chair and sinking into it. He reached for the bottle of whiskey, pouring himself another generous measure. Vincent's eyes followed the bottle, his tongue darting out to wet his lips. Frank caught the look and raised an eyebrow. "You want?" Vincent shook his head, his gaze flicking to Emma, who sat quietly on the sofa, playing with her doll. "I better not." Frank shrugged, sipping his whiskey, the silence stretching between them. "You gonna be around for a while?" Vincent asked, his voice hopeful. Frank shook his head. "Probably not." Vincent leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Frank, I need a favor. I'm having a hard time staying afloat right now. I'm running a little behind on the rent. You think you can spot me a few?" Frank hesitated, his fingers drumming on the table. He reached into his pocket, pulling out 2 crumpled $100 bills. "Is this good?" Vincent snatched the money, his eyes lighting up. "I don't get my check till next Tuesday." "Don't worry about it," Frank interrupted, standing abruptly and gesturing to the door. They made their way to the entrance, Vincent's steps faltering. "Can I ask you for another favor?" Frank raised an eyebrow, his expression wary. "You think you can keep an eye on Emma for a minute? My landlord's a real—" "Can't!" Frank began, but Vincent cut him off. "You'd be really helping me out," he pleaded, his eyes desperate. Frank glanced at Emma, who sat quietly, her eyes wide and innocent. "Frank!" "That's enough!" Frank snapped, his voice rising. "I haven't seen you in a long fucking time." Vincent held up his hands, backing away. All right, calm down." He turned to Emma, his voice strained. "Emma, let's go." Frank yanked the door open, and Vincent hurried out, his footsteps echoing in the hall. Emma followed, pausing in the doorway. "Bye," she whispered, her voice small. Frank didn't answer, slamming the door shut behind them. He leaned against it, his eyes closing, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. "That mother—" A soft knock interrupted his thoughts, and he swung the door open, his voice harsh. "What is it now?" Emma stood alone, her arms wrapped tightly around her doll, her eyes wide and frightened. "Where's your dad?" Frank demanded, his brow furrowing. "He said for me to stay here," Emma whispered, her bottom lip trembling. Frank stared at her for a long moment, his jaw clenching. He closed the door, turning to lean against it, his head in his hands. That mother. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, and opened the door once more. Emma looked up at him, a tentative smile on her face, and Frank felt something stir in his chest. He sighed, stepping aside to let her in. Frank and Emma sat across from each other in the cramped kitchen, the silence broken only by the soft rustling of Emma's rag doll as she played. Frank took a drag from his cigarette, the smoke curling around his face as he stared at the little girl. His eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable. Emma's voice rang out, high and clear, as she began to sing. Little Miss Muffet sat on a tuffet. Frank watched her, his brow furrowing as she continued, her voice rising and falling with the melody. Eating her curds and whey, Emma sang, her fingers dancing over the worn fabric of her doll. She placed the rag doll on the table, its button eyes staring blankly at Frank. He recoiled slightly, his lip curling in disgust at the sight of the tattered toy. Along came a spider who sat down beside her, Emma continued, her hands and face pointing towards the ceiling, her eyes wide with excitement. And frighten Miss Muffet away, she shouted, her voice echoing in the small room. Emma burst into laughter, her hands clapping together in glee. Frank ashed out his cigarette, the embers glowing briefly before fading to gray. Emma held up her rag doll, its limp form dangling from her fingers. This is Dolly, she announced, her voice proud. She took the doll's hands, waving them at Frank, a bright smile on her face. Frank stared back, his expression blank, his eyes devoid of emotion. Where are you from? Emma asked, her head tilting to the side, her gaze curious. Detroit, Frank replied, his voice gruff. Where's that? Emma questioned, her brow furrowing. Frank reached into his pocket, pulling out a couple of cigarettes and placing them on the table. He tapped the table with his finger, his voice low and serious. We are here right now, and I am from all the way up here, he said, his finger tracing an invisible line. Emma nodded, her eyes wide. Where's your wife? She asked, her voice innocent. Frank's jaw clenched, his eyes darkening. I don't have one, he said, his voice tight. Why? Emma pressed, her head tilting to the side. It's complicated, Frank muttered, his gaze sliding away from hers. What about kids? Emma asked, her voice bright with curiosity. No, Frank said, his voice flat. Why? Emma repeated, her eyes searching his face. Frank let out a humorless laugh, his lips twisting into a wry smile. Can't have one without a wife, he said, his voice bitter. Not true, Emma said, her voice firm. Very true, Frank countered, his eyes meeting hers, a challenge in his gaze. Emma smiled at him, her eyes crinkling at the corners. Frank studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Does your dad always leave you alone? He asked, his voice low. Uh-huh, Emma replied. Where does he go? Frank pressed, his eyes narrowing. I don't know, Emma said, her voice small. What do you do if you need something? Frank asked, his brow furrowing. Emma reached into her pocket, pulling out a small pink flip phone. She held it up, her voice proud. My dad got me this. He calls me mostly. Frank stared at the phone, his expression unreadable. Emma met his gaze, her eyes wide and innocent. So, what do we do now? Frank asked, his voice flat. Emma shrugged her shoulders, her rag doll clutched to her chest. The two of them stared at each other as they sat in the cramped kitchen. The first thing Frank can think of was going to the track. The horses entered the paddock one by one, their hooves clopping against the hard-packed earth, their coats gleaming in the afternoon sun. Emma sat in the stands, her eyes wide with wonder, her rag doll clutched tightly to her chest. She watched as the horses walked in a circle, their tails swishing, their manes rippling in the breeze. Frank appeared beside her, his face set in a grim line. He tucked 2 ticket stubs into his pants pocket, his other hand gripping a rolled-up paper. He sat down heavily, his eyes fixed on the horses. Horses are so pretty, Emma breathed, her voice filled with awe. I love how beautiful their hair is. Ooh, look at that one. She pointed to a particularly striking horse, its coat a deep, rich chestnut. A buzzer sounded, harsh and sudden, and the horses began to file out of the paddock. "Where are the horses going?" Emma asked, her brow furrowing. "Come on," Frank said, his voice gruff. "The race is about to start." He stood abruptly, striding towards the racetrack, his shoulders hunched. Emma scrambled to her feet, watching as the last horse disappeared. "Hey, wait for me!" she called, her voice small and lost in the din of the crowd. Emma made her way down the ramp to the seats, her steps faltering. She glanced left and right, her heart hammering in her chest, panic rising in her throat. The stands loomed around her, a sea of unfamiliar faces, the noise deafening. A gunshot cracked through the air, and Emma's eyes flew wide, her breath catching in her throat. The doors to the horses' stalls burst open, and they surged forward, their hooves thundering against the track. Emma let out a cry, her voice high and piercing, the sound ripped from her lungs. In the stands, Frank gripped the rolled-up paper, his knuckles white. He smacked it back and forth against his palm, his jaw clenched, his eyes riveted on the race. The sound of Emma's cry cut through the roar of the crowd, and he whipped his head around, his gaze landing on her small, trembling form. Frank bowed his head, taking a deep, shuddering breath. He pushed his way through the crowds, his steps quick and purposeful. He reached Emma's side, bending down to her level, his eyes searching her face. "Emma," he said, his voice low and urgent. Emma's eyes flew open, and she flung her arms around his neck, her rag doll dangling from her fingers. Frank stiffened, his arms hanging awkwardly at his sides. Slowly, hesitantly, he wrapped his arms around her, his hands patting her back in a clumsy attempt at comfort. He scooped her up, her small body fitting easily against his chest, and strode towards the exit, his face set in a grim line. The announcer's voice boomed over the loudspeaker, crowing about the winner of the race. "And that's it, folks! The winner is lucky number 6, Doc Holliday, ladies and gentlemen. Come to the ticket booth to collect your earnings." Frank reached into his pocket, pulling out the crumpled ticket stubs. He glanced at them, his lips twisting into a bitter smile, before tossing them into a nearby trash can. He shifted Emma in his arms, her head lolling against his shoulder, and walked out of the racetrack, leaving behind the noise and chaos. Frank and Emma perched on a bench outside Yogurt Urway, the sun beating down on their backs. Emma dug into a large container of yogurt, the creamy confection piled high, a mountain of sweetness. Her rag doll sat between them, its button eyes staring blankly into the distance. Frank took a drag from his cigarette, his other hand holding a small cup of yogurt ice cream, the condensation beating on the plastic. Emma giggled as she ate, her laughter bright and carefree. Frank glanced at her, his brow furrowing. "What's so funny?" "Frankie," Emma said, her voice sing-song, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "Huh?" Frank grunted, his confusion evident. "Frankie," Emma repeated, her giggles intensifying. "My dad called you Frankie. I'm going to call you Frankie." Frank's lips twitched, a hint of amusement in his eyes. "You picking on me?" Emma swung her legs, her feet kicking the air as she shoveled another spoonful of yogurt into her mouth. Frank watched her, his gaze thoughtful. "Do you have a nickname?" he asked, his voice low. "Yep," Emma replied, her mouth full. "And what is it?" Frank pressed, his curiosity piqued. "Emma," she said. A smile tugged at the corners of Frank's mouth, and he extinguished his cigarette in his melting ice cream, the embers hissing as they met the cold. "Frankie, can you take a picture of me and Dolly?" Emma asked, her voice hopeful. Frank stared at her, his eyebrows raised in surprise. Emma pulled out her phone, holding it out to him, her eyes pleading. "Please," she said, her lower lip jutting out in a pout. Frank hesitated for a moment before taking the phone, his fingers fumbling with the unfamiliar device. "Okay," he said, his voice gruff. He held up the phone, squinting at the screen as he adjusted the camera. "Ready?" Emma struck a pose, her smile wide and genuine, her rag doll clutched to her chest. Frank snapped the picture, the shutter clicking softly. "Thanks, Frankie," Emma said, her voice warm with gratitude. She took the phone back, her fingers brushing against his. "Where to now?" Frank stared off into the distance, his gaze unfocused, his mind a million miles away. He had no idea what he was doing, no clue how to care for a child, let alone one as vivacious and curious as Emma. The sun beat down on them, the heat oppressive, the air thick with the scent of melting ice cream and cigarette smoke. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the challenges ahead, and turned to Emma, a forced smile on his face. "Let's go see what trouble we can get into," he said, his voice falsely bright. Emma grinned up at him. Frank and Emma ambled along the railroad tracks, the sun-warmed metal beneath their feet, the air thick with the scent of creosote and rust. Emma skipped beside him, her rag doll swinging from her hand, her face alight with curiosity. "Do you have any brothers or sisters?" she asked, her voice bright and inquisitive. "No," Frank replied, his tone flat, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Me either," Emma said, her voice tinged with a hint of wistfulness. Frank glanced at her, his brow furrowing, a question forming on his lips. "Where's your mom, Emma?" Emma's steps faltered, her smile fading. "She's gone," she said, her voice small and sad. "Where did she go?" Frank pressed, his voice gentle. "Heaven," Emma whispered, her eyes filling with tears. Frank inhaled sharply, the weight of her words settling heavily on his chest. Emma looked up at him, her face a mask of sorrow, her eyes pleading for understanding. "Where's your mom?" she asked, her voice trembling. Frank swallowed hard, his throat tight. "Well, when I was your age, she died too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Do you miss her?" Emma asked, her voice barely audible. "'Cause I miss my mom." Frank's heart clenched, a wave of grief washing over him. "Yeah, Emma, I do. We used to take walks like this all the time," he said, his voice thick with memories. Emma nodded, her lips trembling. "My dad says everyone dies sometimes," she said, her voice small and afraid. "Sometimes they just have to go," Frank said, his voice hollow, his eyes distant. "I don't want to die," Emma said, her voice quavering. "I like playing with Dolly and eating ice cream." A smile tugged at the corners of Frank's mouth, a flicker of warmth in his eyes. "Nobody wants to die," he said, his voice soft. "What about the bad people?" Emma asked, her brow furrowing. Frank's steps faltered, his mind reeling. "Bad people?" he repeated, his voice strained. He paused, his thoughts racing, his heart hammering in his chest. Emma watched him, her eyes wide and trusting, waiting for his answer. "My dad says bad people go somewhere else," she said. Frank's throat constricted, his words stuck in his throat. I guess there's a special place for them in heaven," he said, his voice tight, his eyes darting away. Emma's small hand reached up, her fingers brushing against the metal charm that hung around his neck. "What's that?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. Frank's hand closed around the charm, his fingers tracing the familiar contours. "This is my good luck charm," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "It's pretty," Emma said, her voice soft and admiring. She slipped her hand into his, her small fingers intertwining with his calloused ones. Frank glanced down, surprise flickering across his face, his heart swelling with an unfamiliar emotion. They continued down the tracks. He took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders, and walked on. Emma raced towards the swing set, her laughter ringing out across the park, her rag doll bouncing against her hip. Frank followed behind, his steps slow and measured, his mind a million miles away. "Come on, Frankie, push me," Emma called, her voice bright and pleading. Frank sank onto a nearby bench, his shoulders slumping, his face drawn and tired. "Emma, I'm going to take a break," he said, his voice low and gruff. Emma darted to his side, her small hands tugging at his arm, her eyes wide and imploring. "Come on, please," she begged, her lower lip jutting out in a pout. Frank turned away, a sigh escaping his lips, his resolve wavering. Emma's grip tightened, her voice rising in pitch. "Please," she wheedled, her tone whiny and insistent. With a huff of resignation, Frank allowed himself to be pulled to his feet, following Emma to the swing set. She clambered onto the seat, her face alight with excitement. "Frankie, can we take a picture first?" she asked, her voice breathless with anticipation. Frank took the phone from her outstretched hand, his fingers fumbling with the unfamiliar device. "All right," he said, his voice gruff. He paused, a hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Say cheese. No, not just of me, Emma said, her voice firm. Let's do it together. Frank raised the phone above their heads, his arms stretching to capture them both in the frame. Okay. 1, 2, 3, he counted, his voice low and steady. They smiled, their faces pressed together, the camera clicking softly. Frank handed the phone back to Emma, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Let's get this going, he said, his voice gruff but warm. He moved behind the swing set, his hands grasping the chains, his muscles tensing as he began to push. Emma squealed with delight, her hair whipping in the wind, her face alight with joy. Higher! Higher! She cried, her voice rising above the creak of the swings. You want to go higher? Frank asked, his voice teasing, his lips twitching with amusement. Yep, Emma said, her voice breathless with excitement. All right, I'll give you higher, Frank said, his voice booming, his arms straining as he pushed her harder, faster. Emma's laughter pealed across the park, her small body soaring through the air, her rag doll clutched tightly to her chest. Frank smiled, but the moment was shattered by the sound of a car door slamming, the low rumble of an engine cutting through the air. Frank's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing, his body tensing like a coiled spring. A black Cadillac SRX rolled to a stop, its tinted windows glinting in the sun. The door swung open, and a massive figure unfolded from the driver's seat, his bulk filling the doorframe. Wolf Wilkins stood at an imposing 6'5", his frame packed with 330 pounds of solid muscle. He wore all black, his suit jacket a stark white against his dark skin, a blood-red rose pinned to his lapel. Frank's hands stilled on the swing chains, his eyes locked on Wolf, his mind racing. He leaned down, his voice low and urgent in Emma's ear. Emma, give me a moment. Just keep swinging. I'll be right over here, he said, his tone brooking no argument. Emma nodded, her face flushed with exertion, her legs pumping hard as she swung higher and higher. Okay, she said, her voice small and trusting. Frank strode across the park, his steps quick and purposeful, his eyes never leaving Wolf's face. He came to a stop in front of the larger man, his posture tense, his jaw clenched. Wolf, he said, his voice flat and emotionless. Have a seat, Wolf said, his tone smooth and oily, his hand gesturing to the nearby bench. They sat, their bodies angled towards each other, the tension crackling between them like electricity. Wolf's eyes flicked to Emma, a predatory smile curling his lips. I don't remember ordering a hit on a child, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Frank's gaze followed Wolf's, his heart clenching at the sight of Emma swinging happily, oblivious to the danger that lurked just a few feet away. She's nobody, he said, his voice tight, his hands balling into fists at his sides. Wolf threw his head back and laughed, the sound harsh and grating. Babysitting? He asked, his tone mocking. Something like that, Frank said, his voice clipped, his eyes hard. Wolf's smile faded, his expression turning cold and calculating. You're not backing out on me, are you? What's the holdup? Frank met Wolf's gaze, his own eyes blazing with barely contained fury. When have I not gotten any job done? I just took out my friend, and that poor old man. I don't want to come across that again. I'm done cleaning up your mess. Wolf leaned in, his face inches from Frank's, his breath hot and sour. You think we all don't go through this? Man up, Frank. Your friend wasn't the guy you think you knew, and that old man gave up a long time ago. Do you think you turned out perfect? He sat back, his eyes glittering with malice. Frank, you're one of the best in this business. Frank's jaw clenched, his teeth grinding together. What if I don't want to be in this business anymore? Wolf's laughter was sharp and brittle, his eyes hard and unyielding. After this, there's nothing else you can do. Once you live it, it becomes you. Frank stood abruptly, his fists clenched at his sides. If it's about the money, I'll get that back to you. You're gonna have to do this one yourself. Wolf's hand shot out, his fingers digging into Frank's shoulder, forcing him back down onto the bench. He leaned in close, his breath hot and fetid in Frank's ear. "Must I remind you? You are in Louis C.'s pocket. Fuck the money. I could care less. If you don't do this..." He trailed off, his eyes flicking to Emma, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "Things can get real messy. You of all people know life ends a lot sooner than we think. You wouldn't want anything bad to happen to your father now, right?" Frank's hand balled into a fist, his knuckles turning white, his breath hissing through clenched teeth. Wolf sat back, his eyes glittering with malice, his hand reaching up to adjust the red rose on his lapel. The sun glinted off the tattoo on his right ring finger, the Chinese symbol for devil, standing out in stark relief against his dark skin. "Russo can't go to the club tonight," Wolf said, his voice low and menacing. He stood, his bulk towering over Frank, his eyes hard and unyielding. "So, whenever you're done playing games?" His gaze flicked to Emma, his lips curling into a sneer. "I'll be in touch." He paused, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "And sorry about your old man." Frank's jaw clenched, his eyes blazing with barely contained fury. "What am I supposed to do with her?" Wolf shrugged, his expression bored. "I'm not your advisor, Frank. Take her with you." He turned on his heel and strode away, his footsteps heavy on the gravel path. Frank watched him go, his heart pounding, his mind racing with the enormity of the task before him. "Frankie, come play with me," Emma called, her voice bright and carefree, cutting through the tension like a knife. Frank's fist unclenched, his shoulders slumping, the weight of the world pressing down on him like a physical thing. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, and turned back to Emma, a forced smile on his face. Frank's car rolled to a stop at the curb of an intersection, the engine idling, the headlights cutting through the darkness. Emma reached out, her small hand turning down the volume on the radio, the music fading to a soft hum. "Frankie," she said, her voice small and hesitant. "Yes?" Frank replied, his gaze fixed on the road ahead, his hands gripping the steering wheel. "What do you think of my dad?" Emma asked, her eyes wide and searching. Frank paused, his brow furrowing, his mind racing. "Your dad?" he said, his voice low and thoughtful. "Well, I barely know him." He glanced at Emma, his expression softening. "Why? What do you think of him?" Emma's face fell, her lower lip trembling. "I don't like him," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the engine. "Why do you say that?" Frank asked, his voice gentle, his eyes searching her face. "Well, he doesn't like to go to the park or eat ice cream or take pictures," Emma said, her voice small and sad. Frank nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And that's important to you," he said, his voice low and understanding. "Yes," Emma said, her voice firm, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "So, you want him to be a part of your life?" Frank said, his voice soft and sympathetic. "Yes," Emma said, her voice rising, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I would like him to be there all the time. Not just some of the time, all the time." Frank's heart clenched, a wave of emotion washing over him. "I see. And this is important because you love him," he said, his voice thick with understanding. "Wouldn't you love it if your dad wanted to be around you all the time?" Emma asked, her voice small and hopeful. Frank swallowed hard, his throat tight. "He does," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "And doesn't that make you feel good?" Emma pressed, her eyes wide and trusting. Frank's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. "I wouldn't know. I barely see him," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. "Why?" Emma asked, her voice filled with innocent curiosity. Frank's jaw clenched, his eyes darkening. "Because I'm a terrible son," he said, his voice harsh and bitter. He paused, his mind drifting, his thoughts tangled and conflicted. "I don't remember the last time we hung out." "You should go see your dad," Emma said, her voice firm and insistent. Frank sighed, his shoulders slumping. "Yeah, I should," he said, his voice low and resigned. "I bet he would like that," Emma said, her voice bright and hopeful. "I know he would," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Then why don't you?" Emma shouted, her voice loud and accusing. Frank flinched, his eyes squeezing shut, his mind reeling. "I don't know," he snapped, his voice harsh and defensive. He took a deep breath, his mind racing, his thoughts churning. He glanced at Emma, his expression softening, his eyes filled with regret. "You're right, Emma," he said, his voice low and apologetic. Emma grinned, her face lighting up with triumph. "I know," she said, her voice smug. They laughed, the tension breaking, the air between them lightening. "You're not so bad after all, Frankie," Emma said, her voice warm and teasing. Frank smiled, a rare, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "You too, kid," he said, his voice low and gruff. He put the car in gear and pulled away from the curb, the tires crunching on the gravel, the headlights cutting through the darkness. They drove in silence for a while, the radio playing softly in the background, the world outside reduced to a blur of shadows and streetlights. Frank turned onto a suburban street, the houses looming on either side, their windows dark and shuttered. He pulled up to the curb and killed the engine, the sudden silence deafening. "Emma, I need you to stay here for a minute," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Why?" Emma asked, her brow furrowing, her eyes wide with curiosity. "I'll just be a minute. I have some work to take care of," Frank said, his hand reaching for the radio dial. "I'll leave the radio on." "Okay," Emma said, her voice small and uncertain. She hesitated, her hand reaching for her rag doll. "Take Dolly," she said, her voice pleading. Frank took the doll, his expression skeptical. He glanced at it, his lips twitching with amusement, before tossing it into the back seat with a grin. "Hey," Emma protested, her voice indignant. They laughed. Frank climbed out of the car, his steps heavy on the pavement. He made his way to the trunk, his movements quick and purposeful. He popped the lid, his eyes scanning the contents, his hand reaching for a hidden compartment. He pulled out his gun, the metal cold and heavy in his hand, and attached the silencer with a soft click. He glanced around, his eyes darting from side to side, his senses on high alert. The street was empty, the houses dark and silent, the only sound the soft whisper of the wind through the trees. In the car, Emma unbuckled her seatbelt, her small body wriggling as she clambered into the back seat. She picked up her rag doll, her face serious, her eyes shining with determination. "You go with Frankie," she whispered, her voice fierce and protective. "Keep him safe." She tucked the doll into Frank's duffel bag, her small hand zipping it closed with a soft snick. She climbed back into the front seat, her legs swinging, her voice rising in a soft, tuneless song as she stared out the window, waiting for Frank to return. Frank slammed the trunk closed, the sound echoing in the still night air. He strode to the driver's side door, his hand reaching for the handle. He yanked the door open, his movements quick and abrupt. He reached into the back seat, his hand closing around the soft fabric of a blanket. "In case you get cold," he said, his voice gruff, his eyes avoiding Emma's questioning gaze. He grabbed his duffel bag, the weight of it heavy in his hand. He closed the door with a soft click, his footsteps fading into the night. Johnny Russo emerged from his apartment, a cigarette dangling from his lips, his hands fumbling with his keys as he turned to lock the door. The night air was cool against his skin, the streetlights casting eerie shadows across the pavement. He never saw the blow coming. Frank's fist collided with the back of Johnny's head, the impact sending him sprawling, his keys clattering to the ground, his cigarette tumbling from his lips. Frank moved quickly, his hands a blur as he dragged Johnny's limp form back into the apartment, his mind already racing ahead to the task at hand. Inside, Frank bound Johnny to a chair, his movements practiced and efficient. He tore a strip of duct tape from the roll, the sound harsh in the stillness of the room, and pressed it firmly over Johnny's mouth, silencing his muffled screams. Frank stood back, his eyes cold and calculating, his hand reaching for the gasoline canister at his feet. He unscrewed the cap, the sharp scent of fuel filling the air, and tipped the canister over Johnny's head, the liquid splashing onto his face, his hair, his clothes. Johnny's screams intensified, his eyes wide with terror, his body straining against his bonds. Frank watched impassively, his face expressionless, his mind filled with a cold, ruthless determination. He turned away, his gaze falling on his duffel bag, which sat on the dining table, its zipper gaping open. Emma's rag doll peeked out from inside, its button eyes staring accusingly at him, its presence a stark reminder of the innocence he had left behind. Emma's voice echoed in his mind, her words haunting him, taunting him. "Where do all the bad people go?" she had asked, her voice small and afraid. Frank shook his head. He pushed the thought away, his mind focused on the task at hand. Frank now back in the car. He drove through the night, the streets empty and silent, the only sound the soft purr of the engine. Emma slept in the passenger seat, her small body curled up under a blanket, her face peaceful and serene. Frank pulled up to Vincent's house, the tires crunching on the gravel, the headlights illuminating the peeling paint and sagging porch. He killed the engine, the sudden silence deafening, and reached over to unbuckle Emma's seatbelt, his hands gentle and careful. He scooped her up, her small body fitting easily in his arms, her head lolling against his shoulder. He carried her up the porch steps, his footsteps heavy and measured, and turned the knob, the door swinging open with a soft creak. Inside, the living room was dark and musty, the air thick with the scent of stale beer and cigarette smoke. Vincent lay sprawled in an armchair, his sleeves rolled up, a syringe and rubber bands scattered on the table beside him. Frank's lip curled in disgust, his eyes narrowing, his grip tightening on Emma's sleeping form. He made his way down the hallway, his steps quiet and careful, and pushed open the door to Emma's room, the pink and purple walls a stark contrast to the gloom of the rest of the house. He laid her gently on the bed, his hands smoothing the covers over her small body, his eyes softening as he gazed down at her peaceful face. He reached up, his fingers closing around the chain that hung around his neck, and slipped it off, laying it carefully on her nightstand, a small token of his affection, his protection. "I didn't hear you come in," Vincent's voice rasped from the doorway, startling Frank from his reverie. He turned, his body tensing, his eyes narrowing at the sight of Vincent leaning against the doorframe, a beer bottle dangling from his fingers. "Vincent," Frank said, his voice tight, his jaw clenched. Vincent chuckled, the sound harsh and grating. "I scare ya?" he asked, his words slurred, his eyes glassy. "Let's talk," Frank said, his voice low and dangerous, his finger pointing towards the living room. Vincent nodded, his head lolling, his steps unsteady as he followed Frank down the hallway. Frank turned on him, his eyes blazing, his fists clenched at his sides. "I thought you went to pay the rent," he demanded, his voice harsh and accusing. Vincent shrugged, his expression nonchalant. "I did," he said, his words slurred, his eyes unfocused. Frank's gaze flicked to Vincent's arms, his lip curling in disgust at the track marks that marred his skin. "Looking at your arms, I don't think the rent was so important," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "It's not what you think, Frank," Vincent said, his voice pleading, his eyes wide and desperate. "I just needed a little pick-me-up." Frank's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing. "A pick-me-up? While you left your daughter with someone you barely know?" Vincent fell silent, his eyes sliding away from Frank's accusing gaze, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "That little girl deserves a lot more," Frank said, his voice low and intense, his finger jabbing towards Emma's room. "She is worth being proud of. I can't say the same for you." Vincent's face twisted, his eyes flashing with anger. He lunged forward, his hands grabbing Frank's shirt, slamming him hard against the wall. "Who do you think you are?" he hissed, his face inches from Frank's, his breath hot and sour. "You've been with her for one day, and you're a father all of a sudden?" Frank struggled against Vincent's grip, his eyes blazing, his teeth bared in a snarl. "You watch it," he growled, his voice low and menacing. "You just came back in his life, some brother you are." Vincent's grip tightened, his fingers digging into Frank's skin. "You don't know anything, Frank," he said, his voice a low, dangerous whisper. "I know what you are. I know how you treated your father." Frank's eyes flicked towards Emma's room, his heart clenching at the sight of her small form standing in the doorway, her eyes wide and frightened. Vincent followed his gaze, his grip loosening, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "You be careful who you talk to, Frank," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You're a little piece of shit, and you better have some respect. I'm still your uncle." Frank pulled away, his jaw clenched, his eyes hard and unyielding. He strode towards the door, his hand reaching for the knob, his mind already racing ahead to the task that lay before him. "Just because you're living the high life right now doesn't mean it won't come to an end," Vincent called after him, his voice harsh and mocking. "Frankie, don't go." Emma's small voice cut through the tension, her words pleading, her eyes filled with tears. Frank turned, his heart twisting in his chest, his eyes softening as he knelt to her level, his arms opening wide. She ran to him, her small body colliding with his, her arms wrapping tightly around his neck. They held each other for a long moment, Frank's eyes squeezing shut, his throat tight with emotion. He pulled back, his hands gentle on her shoulders, his eyes searching her face. "Emma, I have to go," he said, his voice low and rough, his heart heavy with the weight of his words. She nodded, her lower lip trembling, her eyes filled with a wisdom beyond her years. Frank stood, his hand reaching for the door, his jaw clenched with determination. "Roll down your sleeves, Vincent," he said, his voice cold and hard, his eyes never leaving his uncle's face. Vincent stared back, his expression unreadable, his eyes glittering with malice. Frank turned on his heel and strode out into the night, the door slamming shut behind him, the sound echoing in the stillness of the house. The next morning, Frank cut through the water, his arms slicing through the surface of the ocean waters, his legs kicking powerfully beneath him. He swam with a fierce determination, his mind focused on the rhythm of his strokes, the burn of his muscles, the pounding of his heart. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Frank emerged from the water, his body glistening with droplets, his chest heaving with exertion. He tilted his face towards the warmth of the sun, his eyes drifting closed, his hand reaching up to push his hair back from his forehead. For a moment, he allowed himself to simply be, to exist in the peace and solitude of the early morning. The weight of his responsibilities and his past temporarily lifted from his shoulders. At the hospital, Nurse Annie walked down the hospital hallway, her footsteps echoing on the linoleum floor, her mind already racing ahead to the tasks that lay before her. She approached Max's room, her hand reaching for the door handle, but something made her pause, her brow furrowing as she peered through the small window. Inside, Frank stood at the foot of his father's bed, his shoulders hunched, his head bowed over a piece of paper clutched in his hands. His voice was low and rough, the words spilling from his lips with a raw, painful honesty. "I asked you out. You said yes. I felt blessed. We dated for a while, then got married in style. A couple of years went by and we tried, and finally it was too hard to hide. Your stomach was growing with child." Frank's voice cracked, his eyes squeezing shut, his throat tight with emotion. He took a deep, shuddering breath, his fingers tightening on the paper, the words blurring before his eyes. "Every day I'm excited, not only for our new son, but that you're the one he will call Mom. I cannot wait to take him to a ball game, to call him by his name, to give him everything he will wish to have. For I am the one he will call Dad." Frank folded the paper with trembling hands, his jaw clenched, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. He looked down at his father's still form, his heart twisting in his chest, the weight of his regret and his guilt pressing down on him like a physical thing. "Mom gave me this before she passed," he said, his voice low and rough, his eyes fixed on Max's face. "She would always tell me about how you couldn't wait for me to get here." He paused, his throat working, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. "I always felt you didn't like me, like I was a burden on you. For a long time, I thought I had done something which made you hate me." Frank's voice broke, his shoulders slumping, his head bowing under the weight of his emotions. "This is what made me not want to be close to you," he said, his words barely audible, his eyes filled with a deep, aching sadness. He took a step forward, his hand reaching out to rest on the bed beside his father's arm, his fingers trembling with the force of his emotions. I regret not getting to know you. I know now you were just looking out for me. You were teaching me right from wrong, and you did it the only way you knew how." Frank's voice was thick with tears, his words coming in short, sharp bursts, his chest heaving with the effort of holding back his sobs. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking, his eyes squeezing shut. "I'm sorry for not being a good son. I'm sorry for not visiting." He took a deep, shuddering breath, his eyes opening, his gaze fixed on his father's face. "I'm going to go away for a little while, take a vacation. I want you to know when you wake up, I'll be here." Frank leaned forward, his lips brushing against his father's forehead, his tears falling onto Max's skin. "When I get back, maybe we go to that ball game," he said, his voice low and rough, his heart aching with the weight of his promise. Nurse Annie stood in the doorway, her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes filled with tears. She watched as Frank straightened, his shoulders squaring. He turned towards the door, his eyes meeting hers, his expression unreadable. For a moment they stared at each other, the silence stretching between. Frank looked away first, his gaze sliding past her, his feet carrying him towards the door. He paused beside her, his hand resting on the door frame, his voice low and rough. "Take care of him," he said, his words barely audible, his eyes fixed on a distant point. "Please." Nurse Annie nodded. She watched as Frank walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hallway, his shoulders hunched, his head bowed to the ground. Frank's car rolled to a stop in Vincent's driveway, the engine ticking as it cooled in the afternoon sun. He sat for a moment, his hands resting on the steering wheel, his mind a million miles away. With a sigh, he reached for his bag, the zipper rasping as he opened it and pulled out Emma's rag doll, the fabric soft and worn beneath his fingers. He tossed the bag onto the passenger seat, the contents spilling out in a jumble of clothes and papers. As he reached for the door handle, his phone buzzed in the cup holder, the screen lighting up with the name, Wolf Wilkins. Frank's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing, but he ignored the call, his mind focused on the task at hand. He stepped out of the car, the sun warm on his face, his white shirt crisp and clean against his tanned skin. His jeans were faded and comfortable, his feet bare in his shoes. He ran a hand over his newly shaved jaw, the skin smooth and cool beneath his fingers. Vincent stood in the front yard, the hose in his hand, his eyes fixed on Frank as he approached. Frank held up the rag doll, his voice low and even. "She left this in my car. Is she inside?" Vincent's gaze flicked to the house, his expression unreadable. "She's out back," he said, his voice flat, his hand gesturing towards the door. Frank nodded, his feet carrying him up the steps and into the house, the screen door slamming shut behind him. Inside, the air was cool and still, the only sound the distant laughter of Emma as she played in the yard. He made his way through the house, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors, the rag doll dangling from his fingers. He paused in the kitchen, setting the doll down on the table, his eyes drawn to the window and the sight of Emma running in circles, her dolls clutched in her hands. She wore his necklace, the metal glinting in the sun, her face alight with joy and innocence. Frank leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed over his chest, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he watched her play. Outside, Vincent shut off the hose, the water dribbling to a stop, his feet carrying him towards the mailbox. He paused beside Frank's car, his eyes drawn to the open duffel bag on the passenger seat, the stack of money peeking out from beneath a jumble of clothes. His hand reached out, his fingers closing around the crisp bills, his eyes darting towards the house, his mind churning with the possibilities. He glanced back at the bag, his heart pounding in his chest, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. In the yard, Emma continued to play, her voice rising in a sing-song chant, the words carrying on the warm breeze. "Ring around the rosies," she sang, her feet skipping over the grass, her dolls bouncing in her hands. Frank's smile widened, his own voice joining hers, the words coming easily to his lips. "Ashes, ashes," he sang, his voice low and rich, his eyes fixed on the small, spinning figure of Emma as she danced and played. But the moment was shattered by the cold press of metal against the back of Frank's head, the unmistakable feel of a gun barrel just barely touching his skin. Vincent's finger tightened on the trigger, his eyes hard and unyielding. Frank could barely feel the gun as he continued to sing along with Emma. "We all fall down." The gunshot rang out, the sound shattering the peace of the afternoon, the birds scattering from the trees, their wings beating frantically against the sky. Frank's body jerked, his eyes wide with shock and pain, his mouth opening in a silent scream as the bullet tore through his flesh and bone. He crumpled to the ground, his blood staining the grass, his life ebbing away in a crimson tide. Vincent stood over him, the gun smoking in his hand, his face a mask of hatred and rage. Emma's body shook. She froze in horror. When she realized what had happened, her sobs echoed in the stillness of the afternoon. The rag doll lay forgotten on the kitchen table, a silent witness to the tragedy that had unfolded, a reminder of the love and light that had been snuffed out in an instant, never to be rekindled again.